All right, great. Well, welcome everyone. This is our second annual presentation of the Faculty Research Funding Initiative. And for those of you I haven't met, I'm Jen Katz-Bonin-Contro. I'm the Associate Dean of Research with the School of Education. Thank you for spending a little bit of your day with us to learn about new research in the School of Education. So as a brief background, a few years ago, the School of Education started funding small seed grants for faculty to start a new research project and support their research agenda. So the project can include other faculty across Drexel. It can include doctoral students as research assistants, and we'll learn a little bit more about how they're working on the two current projects. And if you're a faculty member that's attending this presentation today, if you'd like to apply for one of these seed projects, we're going to extend the application deadline to June 10th to allow for a little more time in our busy schedules. And I'll send an announcement out to the faculty listserv just to confirm that. So here's a quote to set the tone for our presentations today. So this quote is from Zora Neale Hurston, and it says, "Research is formalized curiosity. It is poking and prying with a purpose." And I really like that idea because when you're starting out a new research project, that's your job, is to think about it from different angles and to poke and to pry and to kind of generate a new way of looking at something and thereby helping other people learn new information through your research. So what I found interesting also about Zora Neale Hurston is that although we might know her best for her literature and her books and her contributions that way to the Harlem Renaissance, I learned recently that she also was an ethnographic researcher. And so when she was a student, she looked at the impact of Afro-Caribbean folklore and literature to community identity. And that fascinates me as a creativity researcher. So today, I invite you to sit back, relax, and learn about our two presentations. And when you're listening to the presentations, ask yourself, what am I curious about? Why is it interesting? And what else would I like to learn about these topics? Now it's my pleasure to introduce you to the two faculty presentations we're going to feature today. The first one is a narrative analysis of the long-term impacts of the Academy of Natural Sciences Women in Natural Science, or WINS program. The second presentation is transitioning to remote and online teaching during COVID-19. And so what I'm going to ask the lead faculty to do is to introduce their teams as they start their presentation. And I will stop screen sharing and I will hand it over to Dr. Ayana Allen-Handy and Dr. Jackie Genovese for the first presentation.
Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us today. And so as Jenna shared, the name of our study is a narrative analysis of the long-term impacts of the Academy of Natural Sciences Women in Natural Science program. We started this research over the summer and are incredibly grateful for the funding and the support from Jen and the research committee to be able to execute this project over the summer. And even now it's continuing. And so I'll introduce our team. So myself and my co-researcher, Jackie Genovese, it's exciting working with Jackie, a good friend and colleague. And then we have two amazing graduate students that have been working with us, Kimberly Sterren and Augie May Manangsang.
Awesome. So thank you, everyone. We wanted to start off with just a brief video that talks a little bit about our WINS program, and in particular, our newest initiative, the engineering WINS component. So we're going to watch a short video and then I'll give a little bit of background on our WINS program for people who don't know about it.
Hi, I'm Betty Willis. I'm the project manager of Engaging Women in Engineering, Training Mentors to Make a Difference, also known as Engineering Women Natural Sciences, as our team likes to call it, funded by the National Science Foundation. As shown in these statistics, there aren't enough women, especially women of color, in STEM fields. These statistics are even lower in engineering. But as an African American woman, I believe that we can make a change. Women in Natural Sciences is a 40-year program, and in the last 4 decades, it has introduced young women to the sciences with amazing results that speak for themselves. The goal of Engineering Women in Natural Sciences is to transform our natural science curriculum, mentoring program, and internships to replicate these results in the field of engineering. As a WINS alumni, WINS has given me the tools and resources to advocate for myself and other minority groups willing to pursue their careers in STEM. I'd like to introduce to you my little WINS sisters to tell you about their experiences in the Engineering Women in Natural Science program as well.
My name is Soraya Wims, and I am an EngWin student. I think it's important because many kids don't really get experiences with engineering stuff and problem solving skills. So with EngWins, it really helped learning how to actually think through the processes, and if something doesn't work, then you learn something new and then you keep on trying. And I think that's a good skill for kids to have.
I liked how we could build barriers to help save or protect our environment. For example, the seawalls that helped slow down erosion and helped the deposit of sand, and how we could see that and make a little model of it, and that helped us really understand what's happening. I think the engineering component is important because it allows us to put our thoughts into action and do it through our own hands and think of solutions and activate those solutions within our abilities.
So instead of how we learn very broad topics, we get to learn more about people in those fields and their jobs.
Programs such as the engineering component of the Women in Natural Sciences program is important because it allows students from underrepresented communities the opportunity to access STEM fields, especially engineering. Our engineering students are able to make connections between how engineers use the engineering design process to resolve issues that impact our natural world.
The EngWins project is developing engineering curriculum that excites and encourages our students. The project is also training mentors in culturally responsive pedagogies and anti-discriminatory frameworks so they can better support women and minoritized communities in engineering and other STEM fields. We can't wait to share our results with the world. Together, we can fight to make STEM for all a reality.
Great. And I just wanted to point out a couple of things from the video. So WINS is entering its 40th year next year. So it's 39 years old. And it does have some amazing outcomes. So in addition to what you see on the slide here, we also graduate and have alumna in the STEM field at 54% of our students. And if you're familiar with the national averages, and especially the average in Philadelphia, right now, 1% of our Black students in Philadelphia go into STEM. And so we've been having all of these great outcomes. We know the barriers that women of color, especially women of color, have in STEM. And for years, we've been doing studies, but those studies have only been on high school graduation, college graduation. Are they in a STEM career? But we've never had the ability to do a longitudinal study. And we have especially never had the ability to look at our WINS alumna and get the story from their life narratives. And so the most amazing thing that has happened since 2012, when the Academy joined with Drexel University, is me meeting Dr. Allen Handy, because she has allowed me my dream of being able to study the longitudinal effects of WINS. There are not many programs in the country that have a 40-year history that we can study the impact of women, especially women of color in STEM. And so one, I want to thank the School of Education for the money for this pilot study, but two, Dr. Ayana and her team of graduate students to start this pilot study to really have a seminal study in the field of out-of-school time programs, especially those that serve our women in STEM and our women of color. Next slide. So our objectives for this pilot study were really to look at what were the long-term impacts of WING's program on the alumnus self-concept and their identity construction. And so our first research question was to how and to what extent are those long-term impacts of the WING's program on alumnus self-concept and identity construction storied, and represented in their narratives. Our second goal was to explore the long-term impacts of the WINS program on alums, college and career trajectories. And we looked at how and to what extent are the long-term impacts of WINS program on the alumnus college and career trajectory storied and represented in their narratives. And then finally, just to explore the long-term impacts of WINS program on the alumnus socioeconomic status and family incomes to really get at what are those long-term impacts. Next slide.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for having us here today. I'm going to talk a little bit about the methodology we've used to implement this pilot study. For the pilot, we interviewed 10 WINS alumna from the over 900 that have participated in the program over time. We collected data through semi-structured interviews and asked questions about their experiences, influences on view of self, their college career trajectories, and more. And for our analysis, we used a narrative inquiry design. We've conducted a holistic content analysis and have done several rounds of coding, including open coding and axial coding. Our preliminary findings have come with 6 themes. We have culture of sisterhood and supportive mentorship, the development of self-efficacy as women of color, the support for high school academics and college application process, new opportunities to broaden life and STEM-related experiences, and lifelong dedication to education, teaching, and community outreach. To highlight some of their voices and experiences, we're going to share 3 participant quotes with you. Our first participant said that some of my earliest experiences of having to accept that I am different in a world where people don't expect me to exist were through this program. I remember going to Montana, my first time on an airplane, like so many firsts, and I went out to Montana to dig for dinosaur bones. And again, you know, I was the only Black person there and at 14. I don't think I realized how different I was at that point, but I know now and definitely can look back on that and just appreciate that. So having that foundation of knowing that even though if the school week is rough or when I go home, it's not the happiest scenario, at least I know on Tuesday nights at 5, I'm going to be in a room with people who support that I want to be the first Black paleontologist. And here's our second participant quote to demonstrate our findings. Like feelings of sisterhood, those feelings of camaraderie, that was something I had never had before. And I think if I hadn't experienced it at least once in a really intense way, because it was intense, I would still feel like I would still be struggling with a lot of what it means to like be the only person of color in a space. That was one of the things that I really, really value is being around people that look like me, being around people who had a similar socioeconomic statuses. That was the space where I felt like I could be unapologetically myself. And thirdly, I think it instilled that whole like process thing, like the mastery of goals, rather than a grade or whatever. Like you can do this, you can get through this. We've done other things, we've been stuck in the mud, we've had animals stuck to us, we can do this, we can do this. So I just think in some ways it taught us grit in academia. Like we already have grit from living in Philadelphia and going through metal detectors all the time, but like an academic grit, having those mentors and support early on made you feel more confident and that you could get through it.
And so the significance of this work is obviously ongoing. And as Jackie shared, I mean, 40 years of data and history and stories is compelling in and of itself. But the significance of this work is the increasing understanding of the long-term impacts of after-school STEM programs, providing support for the value of such programming, and then the significance of addressing issues regarding equity, diversity, and social justice in STEM education. And in terms of next steps, so again, we are so grateful for the seed funding that has really helped catapult us into this next phase of grant development. We are blessed to work with our grant writer who's on the call, Carol. She's here in the room. I know she'll probably be mad at me for calling her out, but she is such a critical piece of the next phase of this work. And so our next phases are really to close out the pilot data analysis. We've conducted all 10 interviews, development of conference presentation proposals. So we are definitely interested in starting to disseminate this work from the pilot. Peer-reviewed journal articles. So this summer, we'll be continuing the writing processes to get a peer-reviewed journal article out on the pilot findings. And then again, applying for external funding to support the full-scale study. We're really looking at hopefully getting in touch with 100 of the participants over the last 25 years. So we're not really investigating the full 40 years. And then also trying to develop a control group to be able to compare them to girls who were likely to get into the program, but did not. And so we're really excited about the next phase. We'll be partnering with Lonnie Tabb, who's a professor in public health, as our statistician, quantitative expert, to really help us to implement the mixed method methodology moving forward. And that concludes our presentation. Thank you.
Are we allowed to clap? Clap. Clap on mute.
Thank you.
That's great. Does anyone want to pose a question? I would say we have about 12-ish minutes for Q&A, and then we'll move on to the second presentation. Are there any questions about the research project, about the interviewing process, about the girls themselves?
Could you talk a little bit more about the program, how the age of the participants and how they get involved to begin with?
Yeah, I can. So the program is open only to School District of Philadelphia young women. They apply in 8th grade, so they are all rising freshmen. The application process is a 2-part process. They are first nominated, but we make it easy. Anybody can nominate and you can self-nominate. But we do call every middle school in Philadelphia and ask teachers, principals, science coordinators to nominate students. From those nominations, the students get an application. They have to apply. In a normal year, we get probably 300 nominations. Of those, we get usually about 150 or so applications that are completed. From those applications, we select 50 girls to interview, and from them, 25 to 30 get selected for the program. What sets this program apart from many of the other programs in Philadelphia is we do not take the cream of the crop. So if you have straight A's, if we see that, you know, you've been in a program at Drexel or University of Pennsylvania and you've got this amazing resume already in 8th grade, you don't get selected for WINS. But if you are a girl who's never gotten out of her neighborhood, who is a decent student, you know, you got your B's and C's. We also don't do, like, if you're struggling in school, you also are not accepted, because that's not what we do. But if you're just that, you know, good student, you also don't have to be interested in science, which is an odd for a STEM program, but you know, we accept anyone. Then you're accepted into our program. We also leave open a significant number of spots for girls who come from families that are what we call Ellis eligible. So they have very low socioeconomic standing. And it used to be, we used to have criteria that you had to be from a single parent home. That has changed over the last several years, because we realized that you can still need support and have two parents at home. So yeah, so that's our application, how you get in process. And it is a 4-year program. That also something that sets us apart from a lot of after school programs. It is 4 years. It is year round. It's not just a summer program. Our girls start off in the summer. Summer is an intensive program the first year. It's 3 days a week, 8 hours a day. It ends with a week-long trip up in Peak. For many of the students, it's the first time that they've had an overnight trip, not sleeping in their own beds. So it's a significant trip that a lot of our alumni remember. And so the first year is primarily all STEM education all the time. Years 2, 3, and 4 incorporate not only STEM, but then positive youth development. We have a Love Yourself series. And then also college and career awareness. We go on a college trip every year. We break up the United States into North, Central, and South. So by the time our students are ready to apply to college, they have visited 16 to 20 different colleges of all different sizes, shapes, you know, city, country, historically Black institutions. We love to visit colleges where our alumni are presently studying. So a lot of times our alum will give the college tour and really talk about what the experience is like to be at college as a WIN student. And then we also provide like FAFSA help and all of that to sort of do that. And starting sophomore years, they're offered paid internships and paid job experiences at the museum for their career development. And that's pretty much the program.
What an amazing program. Thank you.
Any other questions that people might have? I'm going to throw out a question for you. I'm wondering, for the students who helped on the project, what did you learn through the process about interviewing, and what did you learn through the process of research that you didn't know before?
Sure, thank you so much for the question. It's been a really interesting process, and I've really enjoyed like spearheading the interviews for the girls. I've learned a lot about recruitment. There's been a lot of, you know, even through the pandemic of emailing, and someone will, you know, sign the consent form and we'll set up a date and time, and then something will happen. I have to follow up. So there's just a lot of, I've learned a lot about like the logistical persistence that it takes to to carry out the interviews and the interview process. Even with the support for funding, we're you know, lucky enough through the School of Education to provide our participants with a $50 honorarium. But it still was a challenge to get to this number of 10 participants in the short period of time. And I've definitely learned about listening and my listening skills, and how different participants might answer the same questions in a different way, and the value of making sure that you do interview a good number of people to get that diversity of experiences represented.
And I will just say, Kim and Augie really took the lead on this project. I mean, in many, many facets, it was great to see them as kind of the independent scholars in the work. So grateful for both of their commitment and work on this project.
Well, thank you. Thank you for your presentation. If there are no further questions, I think we'll segue on to the second presentation. So the second presentation, I'm going to hand it over to Dr. Christy Kelly, if you wouldn't mind introducing your team, and I will let you share screen.
Okay, can you hear me okay? Sorry, my computer is getting a little hot and slowing down over here. But really, what an amazing project you've had. I really appreciate your presentation. So hi, everyone. I'm Christy Kelly, and I'm excited to be introducing our team. This is really a student-initiated, student-led project. So our student team was started by Katie Elliott, Katie Matthew, and Kate Fun. And David Matson joined a little bit later. I've been excited to be part of the project as the PI on this, but really it's their project. Jen Katz-Buenacontro and Rajshi Ghosh also have been providing support. So I'm actually going to turn it over to Katie Elliott to get us started.
Hi, everyone. So we are excited to be here and share sort of our preliminary findings with everyone. We're still in the early stages of data collection, so we'll talk a little bit more about that. But today we're going to be looking at the purpose of this research, the research questions, methods, the timeline that we're working on, some preliminary results, and the next steps. Next slide, please. So the purpose of this research was to understand the experiences of educators moving to online teaching during COVID-19. And the idea for this project actually started in the School of Education break room. Katie Matthew and I were getting coffee and tea, and we're having a little chat between classes. And she was like, oh, you know, this whole COVID thing, and this was in February, late January, when it wasn't in the US to the same degree, or the East Coast to the same degree yet. This is really along your line of interest with education and emergencies. And I said, yeah, you know, I keep thinking I should do some research, but like, I'm a little apprehensive about doing it all by myself. Would you want to work on it with me? And she was like, yeah, I guess so. And so then we roped Kate in, and Christy and David and Jen and Rajshi all joined us. But we're really looking at the process of the transition to remote or online teaching, the opportunities and challenges this experience presented for teachers, the strategies they used, how they measured their success, the avenues that this presented for creativity, and the impact on the field. Next slide. The research questions that drove this study were: how do educators navigate the challenges of transitioning to online teaching during a crisis? What resources do educators draw on professionally and personally in the process of transitioning? And then what do educators learn in the process, and how does this affect their long-term understandings of teaching and learning? Kate Fan is going to take it from here.
This is a research project with a mixture of methods. We have been collecting survey data via Qualtrics that focus on educators' experience transitioning to online, as well as topics related to work-life balance, teaching, leadership, creativity, and technology during the pandemic. We also collected demographic data to have a general idea of who took our survey. We have been really conducting individual semi-structured interviews via Zoom, and our interview questions focus on experiences of educators transitioning to teaching online and how this experience impacts their daily life. We recently added questions on educators' views on creativity and how they engage creativity in this transition. We asked about the impact of this experience and their plans moving forward. And we recently started to schedule focus groups where we explore shared experiences and shared perceptions on the transition around several interest areas, including use of technology, work-life balance, gender role, and creativity. And we also intend to organize community of practice around these topics for those interested for resource sharing. And next slide. I'm going to talk briefly about our timeline. So the IRB approval process really took longer than we expected, so that kind of pushed our whole agenda later. While awaiting for IRB, we conducted some literature review and applied for 2 small grants from SSRC and Spencer. And this March, after we got the IRB approval, we were finally able to begin our survey, distribution, and interview scheduling. And this past month, we also submitted an abstract for a lit review paper on how education reacts to past diseases and pandemic to Journal of Education in Emergencies. And hopefully after that past editorial review, we can start working on the full paper. Next slide. We distributed the survey to pre-K to 12 educators through listservs, social media, and our own educator networks around the globe. And our inclusion criteria include anyone who teach pre-K to 12 at the time of study and who have transitioned at least one course from face-to-face to online or hybrid since December 2019. And fortunately, we have got a phenomenal amount of responses, and KDM will talk about some preliminary findings from our surveys.
Thanks, Kate. So we had 234 responses recorded between mid-March and mid-May. One thing we discovered is that it turns out teachers are pretty busy, and fairly frequently they would open the survey, get sidetracked, and not complete it. So there was this really strong bimodal distribution of completion rates where those who did not complete generally completed like 3%, and those that did complete completed to 98 to 100%. So we sort of eliminated those that completed less than 50%, but the majority of those that we retained had completed the entire survey. And also just notably, participants were not offered any incentive for participation in this. Next slide. Most of our participants are from North America, which makes sense since we have mainly distributed through our North American-based Anglophone listservs and teacher network. However, notably, we have been able to reach some teachers elsewhere in the world, and the distribution here shows that the number of participants from different continents is, not negligible. We also have longitude and latitude data related with the Qualtrics, and so perhaps in further analyses we may try to pinpoint people's locations as they relate to their experiences during the pandemic. Next slide, please. Most of our sample were white women. This is perhaps not that surprising since most of our sample is from North America, and this is somewhat consistent with the educator population in North America. As we think about a second wave of the survey, though, we have this consideration in mind and have been thinking of different ways that we can diversify our sample and perhaps reach linguistically different populations. You can see that there's a fairly even distribution of age ranges. And also notably in terms of household size, most of the participants either live alone or with one other person. Although we do have a number of participants who live in larger households, perhaps indicating that they live with a family, which may contribute to their experience of teaching online during the pandemic. Next slide. Most of our participants teach in K-12 and higher ed. There were also options on the survey for vocational schools, colleges, and early education environments, but these were much lower percentages. Most of our participants said they held some kind of leadership role in their school or institution. And most of our participants teach in public schools or institutions, which include charter schools, but there are also many who teach in private institutions. Next slide. So here I'm going to go over some of our preliminary results from the survey, and mostly I'm presenting results that are descriptive or qualitative. As we collect more data and clean the data set, we'll include more inferential methods in our analyses. In terms of the transition experience, remarkably, 42% of respondents said they had less than a day or a few days before transitioning online. Perhaps related to this, we asked participants about their anxiety level about transitioning online on a scale of 1 to 10, where 1 represented no anxiety about transitioning or 10 represented extremely high anxiety. Most indicated that they were in the higher range of anxiety about transitioning online. And a t-test showed that there was a significant difference in mean anxiety between female respondents and male respondents. Mean anxiety for females was 6.5, whereas mean anxiety for males was 5 out of 10. Next slide. We asked participants which technology platforms were provided by their institutions or schools for teaching online. And there was a fairly limited range of these, and most of them were the ones that we're all familiar with, like Zoom and Blackboard, Canva, Flipgrid, Google Suite. But we also asked participants what platforms beyond the ones provided by the school or institution did they find useful. There was a huge range of responses, and in this image, you can see that the most frequent responses are larger, and some common alternate resources that teachers self-sought were Google, Khan Academy, Nearpod, YouTube, etc. Next slide. Creativity. We also asked participants about their own creativity and creativity that they have observed in their students during the pandemic. We asked, in what ways have you used creativity to adapt your teaching during the pandemic? This is an answer from a 36 to 45-year-old male, 3rd, 4th grade teacher and counselor in Asia, and it represents a fairly common response to this question. So he said, finding ideas for lessons or projects online and then adapting them, also being open to asking for input, trying new things, and risking looking silly or making mistakes along the way. Next slide. Another important element of the survey was asking participants about their work-life balance. We asked them to describe a typical day teaching online, and the responses were very revealing. For instance, in this first panel, this 46 to 55-year-old kindergarten teacher has 3 kids at home, one of whom has special needs. And she said, I work from morning until night with breaks for meals. If I'm not planning or recording lessons, I'm online with a group or researching the next activity. In this other panel, a 36 to 45-year-old male university professor said, I don't think there is a typical day. I feel I am mostly doing triage to ensure that the train stays on the track. And perhaps that experience is relatable to many of you and all of us, really. So it's clear that educators have struggled, and in order to understand the experience better, we conducted interviews. The final survey on the question asked whether participants would be interested in participating in an interview, and David is going to talk about the preliminary findings from the interviews.
Yes, thank you, Katie, for that excellent part of the presentation there. We had up to 32, we've had 32 interviews, semi-structured interviews to date, all conducted over Zoom, with diversity of respondents, both binary and both male, female, and also race and ethnicity. We've had interviews have not been contained to just the participants from the continental United States or North America. Those have been international as well. And also not just teachers, but people with leadership positions and administrative positions as well in their school. We can go to the next slide. So just as some of the results, and we can think about them in alignment with some of the results you've seen from the survey and from the research questions, aligned with the idea of the stress that comes along with transitioning, and the way the respondents in the survey identified having higher stress and quick transitions. One of the topics that we talk about with all of our interviews is how that transition happened. And we have had a diversity of responses in that, but typically we have these a range from people who have had support in their transition, who worked hard to make that happen, to folks who have been absolutely working nonstop to try to make this transition happen. Some even to the point of thinking about leaving the profession, others at other points needing other kind of assistance to make it through those times, and different techniques we use by people at leadership and administrative positions to try to help teachers navigate through that. A lot of the difficulty within that, and in that moving online, of course, has been managing technology. Some of that has included learning new applications. A lot of the time we've seen has been having to do with learning to do the videos, recording lessons, and managing how to put those online and navigate engagement with students. We've also talked a lot with different teachers on the creativity front, how this has changed their perception of their own creativity and the way they think of creativity engaging with their students. And again, this has to do with the technology and moving online. So some of that creativity has been engaged with the idea of having new constraints about how you present your lessons, the idea of recording videos and being creative in the way they present themselves and their material to their students. So there's a lot of problem solving there for them. But changing their perception of what it means to engage creatively with their students as they do not have access to some of the same materials. And again, this could be best represented perhaps in the fact that we've interviewed several teachers who are arts or music teachers who have very specific constraints in the way that they interact with their students. For example, not having musical instruments, and even those who are hybrid, not being able to sing in the same room, right, because of different restrictions because of COVID, even if they are going back and forth between online and hybrid. So a lot of nuance in that category. And then work-life balance, self-care and leisure. I think the quote that Katie shared from the survey about triage and keeping the train on the tracks really applies here as well. We've had a wide range of folks who have been extremely disciplined. We have one participant who, because she was home because of COVID, she was able to assist a partner who was going through chemotherapy and be there consistently. So we had a range from that perspective to someone else who was, again, going to counseling, seeking help because of this stress, and then others who are considering leaving the profession due to the way this has affected them emotionally and professionally. So we have a wide, unique range of individual responses here. And this is, and it also affected their ideas about the future of education, ideas about what they want to take forward. Some of that has to do with technology that they've used and things that they want to see implemented moving forward. And others, in fact, impacting critical ideas about the way education has been even before this, that have been exacerbated and demonstrated in new ways as they try to have some sort of voice within what's going on and what's being asked of them and the way that they're able to work within their institution. So we can go to the next slide.
Yeah, so while the data collection is still ongoing, there have been some overarching themes and reoccurring concepts that have stood out to us. We all got the impression that educators want their voices to be heard and want their stories to be told. And this is conveyed in the large number of respondents, participants, and the enthusiasm from our participants to share their experiences during the interviews and focus groups. And we see that educators are being resilient and tried so many different ways to make this transition happen. They also make sure that students still get quality education and get cared for, but sometimes some of them can feel angry, exhausted, and underappreciated for their efforts at work or at home. And then pass on to Katie.
So we're also seeing creativity take new forms, but at a cost. One example that came up was a instructor in higher education who had a student who was pregnant and in the hospital with COVID, and they had to find a creative way for her to finish the semester and take her exams. So creativity is being used both in serious, dire situations and more run-of-the-mill daily situations. And then finally, teaching remains a feminized, non-expert field, and technology remains a masculinized field and is treated as requiring expertise, except for when teachers use it. And educators continue to have little control over their working conditions. And this was hit home in a number of interviews with teachers saying that they weren't sure whether they would continue teaching after they got through this. So thank you for being with us today. We're happy to talk about next steps or answer any questions that you may have for us.
Oh yes, another round of applause, right. Thank you, Ayana. Excellent job, and thank you so much for the students for presenting their research. Does anyone have any questions they'd like to pose to this group?
Ask a question. Since you in your sample have educators from diverse levels of education, are you looking at maybe some differences or similarities across like elementary school, high school, higher ed, and their experiences transitioning during the pandemic?
Yes, definitely. That's definitely a way that we'll divide the data set eventually. But at this point, the data's a little bit messy still. And since we're planning a second wave of survey dissemination, we'll probably save that analysis for June or July. Thanks for the question though, Kim.
I have a question. I just want to commend the group on an important study and all the work that you've done so far. It's very impressive. So just from like anecdotal personal experience, it seems like everyone has experienced this pandemic differently. I have 2 kids under 5. My brother has a daughter who's 10. Colleagues who have teenagers, but the challenges are all there, but they're different. Have those differences emerged in the data, and how will you kind of explore parsing that out as you report results and move forward to try and like bring resolutions or recommendations to teachers who are still trying to figure this out a year into the pandemic?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's what we started talking about last week when we started planning this presentation, was that the range of experiences is just so wide. Like some people are like, I have gained time. Some people are like, this is great. I'm totally going to incorporate these things. Maybe we'll do like a class from home once a semester or something. And then there are other people who are really, really struggling every single day. And there are a couple things which, not surprising, seem to align with some of those, although not everyone falls into those categories. But we found people that have young children, that's been a struggle. People who are teaching in high needs communities, that's been a struggle. And then the other thing that continues to show up is the amount of leadership and support at their institutions seems to make a great deal of difference in how teachers have experienced the entire transition. And I don't know if anyone else wants to add to that, but definitely the breadth of experience has been, is reflected in our interviews and in the data so far.
Yeah, I can add to that just briefly. I would just say that thank you, Brian, for asking that question. I was going to ask you a question if you didn't ask a question, because I know this is so relevant to your research and your experience. So appreciate you coming in. We absolutely have had that. We had multiple interviews with people who have had kids and have one of the participants had been going to therapy with the kids because of trauma that has been caused because of the circumstances around this, and others that were really grateful to have had that time with their kids and be able to input and help be a teacher to their kids as they were working from home. And so we've had that. So one thing that's going to, I think, be really important, and this maybe I'll throw it over to Kate Matthew, is that looking for perhaps some tendencies or some results from the survey that we can apply and sparse out the diversity of our interviews to try to create some additional questions that might give some clarity on certain factors that perhaps might group those responses, because the interviews have provided such a rich description of a lot of different kinds of experiences.
Yeah, I would just add that that's definitely something we're considering, and we're looking at ways of sort of capturing those breadth of experiences, both in the quantitative and qualitative data.
I have a question. On the last slide, you talked about the workforce being feminized, which I definitely understand. I'm curious how you arrived at the non-expert characterization in that last bullet on the last slide.
Yeah, one of the things we've run into in the interviews is that many of the teachers, many of the educators don't have experience teaching in online spaces. So while they may be experts in general classroom instruction, they're not, there's been a lack in technological pedagogical content knowledge and just technological pedagogical knowledge as well. One of the people I interviewed was like, yes, I had taught and taken a class online, but for most people that was not the experience. So the expert really has to do with the technological aspect of it, not the instructional in a broad sense. But good question.
Thank you.
I will add on to that as well, because I think there's a difference in terms of the higher education versus the K through 12 environment. And what we're seeing is that faculty who work in the more masculine fields, the STEM fields, are perceived as having the expertise for moving online, despite the fact it's often the feminized spaces like nursing and health, which have already been online and doing work. And so their knowledge in these spaces is not usually considered expertise, it's just something they do. And so the men, even in the K through 12 as teachers, they're perceived as bringing technology expertise, while the women's technology expertise is perceived as just something that's inherent in them. And so that expertise is something that is, we think is going to have long-term impact in terms of who is going to get leadership positions, who's going to survive this, who's going to get more jobs and positions. We've also heard people being laid off along the line, changing jobs, switching career paths, moving to new states with better work-life balance, even though they might be teaching across borders in other spaces. So again, I think that is going to continue to impact the data that we get. I will just say one more thing, kind of observing and watching and being part of this team. This is incredibly emotional research. There isn't a story that we're hearing that isn't really truly coming out of crisis mode. I started my career working in refugee camps, and the amount of emotional labor working in those spaces is what this team of students is dealing with as we're going through this data. So I just want to commend them for taking on this project and for kind of being there and available to the research participants when they need to be there. They really need their stories told. And so the service that's being done here is far bigger, I think, than even the impact of the research that will happen. So I'm just really proud of our School of Ed for picking this up as an important research project. And thank you for the funding to help them do that.
Well, what's really interesting is if you draw any parallels or similarities across both projects, is there's this what I got is there's a tremendous need and a sense almost of relief to be able to express one's point of view and have other people understand what you're saying and to be able to convey that. And I think that's the art of research, because there's a scientific process of, following your method, being systematic, looking for the validity and reliability, but the artistic and humanistic side of it is being able to have some kind of social impact. And also, I think, to create community around your research, because both groups have developed their own unique communities and their own sort of like system, it sounds, and process, because they're very close-knit communities for ensuing these research problems. I meant to say pursuing.
I have one more question, if there's time. I was curious, I made a note about the asynchronous focus groups, and I was curious what your experience has been utilizing those as a data collection technique, and maybe a little bit of a description as to how that was designed.
So I can speak to that a little bit, in that we have tried a synchronous focus group, and that was not super successful in terms of scheduling. So I ran an asynchronous focus group for a professional organization earlier this calendar year, and had pulled a bunch of research on how to structure that and how to run it. So we'll be piloting some asynchronous ones this summer, and I'm happy to share the findings or the research that I'm using to help structure that. The one thing I would say is that it lacks, the biggest challenge in my past experience has been having like the rich conversations that you're really looking for from a focus group. So I'm still working on how to figure that out.
And I assume, is it written like a discussion board, or is there a voice memoing option for the participants?
That's a great idea. I had done it written through Google Classroom, where there was a different prompt that came in every single day. But I love the idea of the voice messaging. I think that could really add something to it, both in terms of like user experience and in terms of the data that we're collecting as researchers.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I may email you just to find out more.
Yeah,
cool.
that would
Thank
be
you.
great.
With the asynchronous focus group, can the participants see the other comments from the other people? So it still has that shared experience kind of, or the influence. So people would influence, almost like a wiki page that you would see in Blackboard or something.
Yeah.
Just curious.
Yeah, you can also, I've used it on USAID grants in Vietnam among multilingual groups. So you can also bring in different languages. You can bring in photos and images, other video bits to kind of prompt conversation. So it does work, and especially across time zones, people who have different schedules. We'll see how it goes here.
Yeah. Thank you so much. Well, I just wanted to allow people a chance to wrap up and to thank once again both of the groups for taking time out of your busy spring schedules to compose these amazing PowerPoints and presentations. And I know that a lot of people have super jam-packed schedules right now. So thank you so much to Ayana and Jackie and their team. And thank you so much to Christy and your team. And we look forward to more continued awesome research. And once your publications come out, if you don't mind letting us know, we can feature that under the publication part of the research website, because we're making a little star next to ones that were seed funded by us. So we can show people that this is a dissemination effort as well from your research. So thank you so much. And I think this will conclude our presentations. Thanks for joining us, everybody. It was great to see you.
Thank you.